gonna keep trying to click around to try to make this work somehow. Um,
Yes.
yeah.
In the midst, would you
Okay.
mind telling us a little bit about who you are, your journey into what you do, and of course, what you actually do?
Yeah. So my journey into what I do is honestly not that exciting. It's like well, so my parents met working in public radio, which I always thought was kind of romantic. But then the older I got, I realized that like my mom was an intern and my dad was an employee. I was like, oh, that's so not cool. But they weren't radio producers. Like my mom recorded concerts and my dad worked in public relations, but they worked around lots of public radio producers. So they were always like, that's a job. Like people have that job. You know, they weren't like, that's crazy. Who makes radio? It's like, yeah, people do that. So that was always kind of going on in the background and the radio was always playing. But I grew up in New York and I went to an exhibit at the Cooper Hewitt, which I guess is kind of like canonical now, called Design for the Other 90%. As like design for design that helps everyone around the world live better, design that's really accessible, design that's really useful. And it really resonated with me. And I was like, this is what I have to do. I have to design. And then it turns out I'm awful at it. Like making decisions is really, really hard. Like picking the color of an item, I can't do it. I get overwhelmed. And I realized that's the thing I like about radio. It's more like I think if you were to compare it to any sort of creative art, I think it's more like putting an outfit together rather than designing clothes. Like I'm not making the thing from scratch. I don't have a blank white screen and everything is possible, which is completely daunting. There's like a real set of parameters and I'm limited by the information that people have told me, the interviews I've done. Like I have to use what I have. And so actually, PJ Vogt from the podcast Reply All called making radio cooking from the kitchen or cooking from the pantry, which I love. It always feels like, okay, you've got like 5 cans of tomatoes and 2 potatoes and some dried berries. Like, what are you going to make? It always feels like that. Every time I make a radio story, it's like, oh shit, I've collected these random things and how am I going to turn it into a story? So I started kind of doing that on my own. I started just like interviewing professors in college that I thought were interesting, just like on this cheap recorder, and I would like edit them in GarageBand and play them on my student radio station. And then that turned into, after many rejections, an internship at NPR, and then a bunch of other like short-lived internships, and then an internship at 99% Invisible, which turned into a job. So this is really like the only job I've ever had.
Really? So with starting as an intern and now being who you are now, what have been, I guess, some critical points in your own journey as it relates to really helping people understand the nuances of what's happening in the world and the built environment?
That's such a lovely question. Thank you. I mean, it's funny because it's kind of the benefit of being a novice in a way. I started out by being like, oh shit, I know nothing about architecture. Like, what do I know? I know nothing. And so it began as this kind of scramble to, I mean, that sounds kind of selfish, but you know, like put your mask on before helping others. Like it began as a wild scramble to like teach myself stuff pronto. Like I had to just learn. And it's funny because I think that nervous energy was actually a benefit. It meant that when I was about to interview an architect, I would like read their book 5 times to really make sure I knew what I was talking about. I was also super young. I mean, I started when I was 22 and I was really scared of coming off like a kid. And so it's a lot of that imposter syndrome, but it really, really helped. And also a lot of it was like, I mean, yeah, since most of the interviews were over the phone or remote, they couldn't see that I was like a woman and kind of young And so I felt very compelled, and I thought I was like knew something about architecture. So I felt very compelled to fake it. And it's funny, for a while I was thinking about taking college courses at the local community college about architecture and design to really educate myself. And I was like, wait a minute, not knowing anything is a huge benefit. Because especially with storytelling, especially because like once you get into a field of expertise, everyone will say, like, I'm working on a story right now about Las Vegas and about the book Learning from Las Vegas, which like helped create postmodernism. And architects are like, oh yeah, everyone knows that story. And by being a little bit outside of it, by being kind of a novice who doesn't know anything about architecture, I can say like, well, I've never heard of it before. I can't take it for granted. That's new to me. And it helps me continue to see things with fresh eyes. Because of course, once you get into like a professional niche, like there's a world that exists. There are cliches that exist. There are stories that architects think everyone knows. And like most people don't actually know. So that's kind of where it came from, honestly, was like realizing, just kind of wanting to educate myself. And it's funny. It's like, and I loved listening to 99% Invisible. I loved the things it taught me. And I just kind of played along and pretended I knew what I was doing. And it's funny because it felt so small when I first started. It felt like this teeny little show. I never imagined that as many people were listening as they actually were. And it still kind of freaks me out to think that a lot of people are listening. So I guess it sounds kind of selfish. It is selfish. Like I'll say it's selfish. I just kind of made the work that I wanted to educate myself, and I made the work that I wanted to hear. And just kind of focused on that. I was never like, how can I help with people? How can I help them learn? Because I think if you think like that too much, you'll get totally paralyzed with fear. And I think the producers of S-Town, do you guys listen to S-Town? Yeah. It's they said something like that too. It was like, we just want to make something that delights ourselves. So that made me feel better.
Good stuff. Does anyone here have any questions for Avery?
I want this camera to work. It's so good to see you all. I like, it's driving me nuts.
No? Yes? Eva! Oh, this can be
So there are a lot of stories that kind of like go down this sort of rabbit hole.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if you could kind of like talk about how, is it just like, does it just happen? Or is it kind of like, you see one thing and it leads to another, or how that experience is like?
Right. That's such a good question. That is such a good question, because every single time I do a story, I'm like, oh, finally an easy one. Like this will be an easy one. And I have to learn to just stop saying that, because everything is complicated when you get under the surface, and it like naturally leads to rabbit holes once you start doing research. So like, working on this story right now about Las Vegas, I'm like, man, we could do a 17-part series about Vegas. Like every single building on the strip has a crazy story, and every single character involved in this has a crazy story. Because I mean, look around the room, like you all have your own, like, I don't know, everyone has their own private world. They have their own universe of stories. And once you start scratching that a little bit, you can't help but fall down some rabbit holes. So like, I don't know, for example, a long time ago, I did a story about the hashtag and where the hashtag came from. And then like, I thought it was going to be like, oh, a little history. We'll just walk them through a simple history. And then it ended up being this, I ended up on the phone with these old employees at Bell Laboratories who helped design the layout of the telephone keypad. And it was like a total accident, because you think like you find these alleyways and you're like, well, I might as well just call them up and like talk to them about it. And every branch leads to like 5 more branches, which then of course makes the story more complicated, because, then you have to cut it down and make it something legible. But yeah, it's funny because the tragic part to me is every time I hear a story of a piece of 99% Invisible, I can only hear all the things we left out. I'm like, oh man, we talked to like 5 other people who didn't make this cut. And so sometimes I'm like, man, our show gets so narrow, it gets so edited down. And so it makes me feel very happy that you think that the rabbit hole-iness of it still comes through, that you still think that, because because believe me, before the edits, it's even crazier.
Indeed.
So, yeah.
So Avery,
Yeah.
as part of this class, which is called Design as a Catalyst for Change, the students have had to engage with the public to ask questions and inquire about the subjects related to food, food and equity, food and justice, food and access, and authenticity. And they're kind of wrapping up that part of the process. But if you had any insights to give to them about talking to strangers and talking to people and interviewing them, what would you advise?
Oh my God, that's so interesting. I know there are a lot of you here, but I'm so curious to know what kind of projects you are working on. I mean, to what degree? You said they're finishing up, so like you've all done your interviews and everything? Okay. I mean, so I guess this is kind of delayed, but I guess the most important thing I find is to talk to someone in there, to get them doing something, to like bring in the action, to be like, I think the greatest radio stories that you hear, or the greatest stories that you hear, like follow someone doing something. There was this classic NPR piece once upon a time that what's his name, David Kestenbaum made, where he was talking to a scientist about this kind of prolific weed, and they're talking in the studio, and then you hear David go like, well, wait, can we go look for it? He's like, okay. And then you hear them like out on the street in New York City, like trying to find this weed. And he's like, this is how you identify it. Here's how we're going to find it. And like, that's what makes it exciting, is they like bring in the action. Especially like, and that's the exciting thing about talking to someone like a chef or like an artist, like someone who creates things. Be like, well, show me your work. Like, how did you make this? Like, point to that. And honestly, that's the thing I love about doing a program about objects. And like, as you know, as designers, like objects in the built environment tell us so much about people. And it makes it so much easier. And it's so much easier as an interviewer to be like, tell me about this object, way more so than like, tell me about you. Like if you ask people to tell them about like themselves, people clam up, and it's really hard, you know, it's really hard to explain your philosophy of doing things or describe your entire history. But if you can explain like how you made this object or this dish or whatever, like that will, parts of them will come through in that. So I definitely say like, and I'm sure a lot of you have done this, like go into their environment. And then I guess the other thing is just like research, which also comes from that imposter syndrome I was talking about, of just like, and I still have it because I still don't know anything about design and architecture. I just like read. If someone's written a book, I'll read it like 3 times. And then like, I never make a list of questions and go through. I just prepare the hell out of myself and then just go in prepared to wing it, because the element of surprise and excitement leads to really fun interviews as well. So what I like to say is make a plan and abandon it. Like prepare for everything you would possibly want to talk about, and then be prepared to say like, well, let's go outside, show me the weed, or, you know, let intuition guide you, which is funny. I don't know. Have you guys seen that show Unreal on Hulu?
Yeah. Is it on
Unreal?
No. Is that different?
No, like a bachelor, but like a fake bachelor.
Oh.
Yeah. It's awesome. Like I don't like The Bachelor. Or I thought I was like, The Bachelor, that's so trashy. But I watched this show, and actually it's incredible because it shows you like how people get amazing footage out of other people, of course, in a like very manipulative, awful way, and they like get them to do terrible things. But I found it like surprisingly relevant for what I do and maybe what you do in terms of like getting reactions out of people and like figuring out, yeah, just watching these producers at work and the ways they engage with their subjects. I mean, it's like it's simultaneously an example of like what you don't want to do and also like what you could have the capacity to do as someone in charge, as someone who's interviewing. Because like the thing about The Bachelor is it's based on interviews. Like it's all, you're talking to them, like the producers are talking to the contestants and like trying to get reactions out of them and like trying to get strong emotion out of them. And like they do it really, really well. Granted, the contestants are drunk. They've been locked up in this mansion for many days. Like there are all these factors that of course we don't have access to, but I found it just like fascinating. And it's based on this woman's real experience working for The Bachelor. So it's like an extreme dystopic example of bringing in action.
Whoa.
Which is funny.
Whoa. So Avery, we have about 10 more minutes with you, and I wanted to see if anyone else had any curiosities, any inquiries that they wanted to ask. Oh, Devin, hello.
Hi.
Oh, hi. There you are.
I heard you mention multiple times that you read a lot. You just like read books over and over just to get the essence of someone, I guess. How important is that process to everything you do, like going and reading someone else's work about this person or reading their work?
Yeah.
How does that
go? Oh, I'm so glad you asked. Well, it's funny. So we work in a building with an architecture firm, and this architecture firm wants to create an exhibit all about podcasting. And they were like, in the middle of this exhibit, we're going to put in a room with a microphone where people can people can podcast live, and like you guys can come in and podcast and everyone will watch you podcast. And I was like, you know, the part where you're in front of a microphone is like 10 minutes, right? Like that's nothing. Like what most of my job is literally reading shit, like just reading shit over and over again and then transcribing interviews. Like the actual glamorous moment of putting someone in front of a microphone is like hardly a part of it. So yeah, I think reading everything you can is like tantamount. And I always read with a pen. I'm just like underlining. And then I go back and I like write down what I've underlined. But again, like I know a lot of my coworkers don't do that. For me, it's a lot of nervous energy that goes into that. And then also a big part of it is just talking to people, which I'm sure you know as designers is like, I know there are a lot of artists who like don't want to talk about what they're working on. And don't want to talk about works in progress. Like my partner is a cartoonist and like he never wants to talk about what he's working on in the meantime while he's in the thick of it. But like I can't work that way because I think a really essential part of doing any kind of work is like doing a lot of reading the most you can and like talking to as many people as you can. So every time I go to a party, every time I go out for drinks with people and someone's like, how are you? I'm like, well, let me tell you what I'm working on. Let me tell you what this is about. Because people are amazing and they have amazing insights and amazing connections. They'll say like, oh, well, I just saw a documentary about that. Or like, I just read a book on that. Or, hey, my friend works in that industry. Like you never know what kind of connections you'll make just from talking to people. And also like when you practice talking about what you're working on, you really practice storytelling. You practice telling the narrative of your project, which is so important to like pay attention to and to pay attention to the parts that grab people and the parts that people get bored by. So like, I'm trying to think. I mean, honestly, 90% of my stories have come from talking to people and then they connect me with like a friend of a friend of a friend who happens to be an expert or who happens to like know someone. And then like, you know, the other percentage comes from like reading and then falling down a rabbit hole. So I guess just like soak everything up and get too much information and then whittle it down later. And that's what makes it hard, but that's also what makes it like fascinating. Yeah.
Sweet deal. So
yeah,
two final quick ish questions.
Yeah.
One, what's your next big story? And secondly, how can students in this class stay connected with you and your journey?
Oh my God. Well, hit me up anytime. I'm Avery at 99pi.org. Seriously. Friends of D's are friends of mine. And also, if you want, like, I don't know, I'm happy to provide. I don't know how many of you actually like are interested in doing audio storytelling, but there are great resources online to teach yourself. And my number one thing is like, it's not that hard. It just takes a lot of time. You can teach yourself. I taught myself, and you don't need expensive equipment. Like, it should be super diplomatic. So I'd love to help anyone out who's interested in that. And my next story, so I'm doing this story about Las Vegas, which is something I've always wanted to do. It's fascinating because the Vegas Strip like changes every 10 years because like it's different from downtown Vegas. It's a town built for tourists. So it changes based on like what tourists want. It's a town that changes based on like market research and demographics, and you can like witness the change instantly. It's fascinating. So I'm working on that story. And then I'm actually going to bow out of 99% Invisible for a while because I'm working on our first ever spin-off series, which is about clothing. Because in all this research, about design, I've always been like, well, why aren't we talking about fashion? And it's like, because fashion's silly, but fashion's not silly. Textiles are the most, it's like a piece, like architecture, it's a piece of design that we are.
Could see you because you're so fashionable. And, like you expressing that's your next like pathway, it would make so much sense in that regard. But thank you so much for joining us. It's always a joy to chat with you, but even more so that you were so willing to wake up super early. It's like what a.m. 8:42 in Oakland, but to join us for our class. So thank you.
Thank you. It's so nice to meet you, and it's so good to see you, Dee. I'm sorry I can't get my camera in order. I'm a grandma. But anyway, Godspeed, everyone. And please, I would love to see what your projects end up looking like. I'm very curious.
Yeah, we can make that happen for sure.
I'd love that.
All right. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.